Hey Dave, how you doing today?
Dave.
Ah, not Dave. Not Dave today. Dave is away. We have Mr. Cole Williams, our associate advisor, taking his place, and I made the mistake of letting Cole pick today's topic, and of course, he picked a doozy for us. So I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce what you want to talk about today, Cole. I got my notes ready, and we'll fire into it.
Yeah, well, obviously, we just had a presidential election, and elections have consequences, primarily as far as taxes go, right?
Is that what we
So
call them? Consequences?
and they have consequences. One of the larger planning topics that we've had over the last year or so has been the sunsetting of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was a tax bill that was implemented under Trump's first presidential term, which has given us the current tax rates that we have and made some substantial changes to the tax code. And it was set to sunset in 2026. So, in theory, regardless as to whether or not Trump was going to be the president or if Kamala Harris was to be elected, 2025 was going to be the last year of those bills. And it's interesting now to evaluate those bills, talk about whether or not they're still going to be in existence, and see if there's any expected changes, etc. So I thought it'd be a fun topic because everybody loves talking about taxes.
Yeah, so for the record, Dave is on vacation and you jumped on the show and said, "Hey, you want to talk about politics and taxes this
Yeah,
morning?"
everybody's favorite. Everybody's favorite.
A couple of notes on that topic. When we take a look at this stuff and as we present it in the show, it is informational only. And what I mean by that is I try very hard not to take a side on the political spectrum. There's a lot of things going on in this country that don't really have anything to do with taxes and other potential consequences, as you say, of the election. And we would love to have those conversations with people if they would like in a private setting. But for today's purposes, we're just going to kind of go over what we know and kind of how this Tax Cut and Jobs Act got put into place and thinking through like what potentially is going to happen. And then also spend a little time talking about tariffs because those have been in the news quite a bit and what the potential ramifications of something like that would be. So, with my disclaimer there, Cole, one of the
Yeah.
interesting things coming into this election that I thought was yes, we have this sunset. So, depending on who wins the presidency, that might have an impact on where we go from here. And in the other side of that is when we look at who wins Congress, that has another part of it, right? And so, like, my thought process was we're a pretty divisive country, and it wouldn't surprise me to get one side of the aisle in the presidency and the other side in Congress. And my thought process there was gridlock means nothing probably gets done. And worst case scenarios, we kind of go back to the old tax by default because nobody can get along long enough to actually make those decisions that we, elect and pay them for. But alas, that did not turn out that way. We actually have Republicans kind of in control, which leads us to believe that there will likely be some extension of some of the major parts of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And the good news is because they have that control, we will probably see something in the first few months of the year, which is always nice because that gives us as planners time to kind of digest and think through what we should be doing for clients as opposed to like, hey, by the way, for last year, we're going to make this rule, right? So I think there is some good news coming out of that. One of the big ones I want to touch on is the one of the kind of the controversial tax acts as a part of the original law was this SALT cap of $10,000, and it's kind of been not exactly loved on either side of the aisle. So that's definitely a negotiating point. For though, you want to explain what the SALT cap is, Cole?
Yeah, so the SALT cap it has to do with state and local income taxes, or I guess not necessarily income taxes, but state and local taxes. And previous to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, there kind of wasn't a limit on that. You could deduct, I believe, as much as you wanted, but now that cap is at 10,000, which does it's kind of a deceptive number because for those who don't know, there is our traditional tax system. But in the 70s, there effectively the IRS was bamboozled a little bit, and they came to realize that a lot of wealthy people were taking advantage of existing tax law, and they were taking massive losses. And as a result, they really weren't paying income tax. So in the 70s, they created something called alternative minimum tax, or AMT. And AMT is also kind of always running parallel to your existing normal tax rate and structure. So even though people could deduct large amounts of your state and local taxes, basically AMT is there to make sure that you're still paying what the IRS kind of deems to be like a reasonable tax rate for somebody in your bracket. So kind of a kind of a deceptive thing, and obviously only largely impacts people that live in states that are high, people who are high W-2 wage earners, and people who live in states that have substantial state and local tax rates anyway, which tend to be places like New York and California, and those tend to
Mm-hmm.
be blue states. And on the political side of things, given it was a Republican bill, does kind of get at the politics of that a little bit.
Sure.
But yes, that is going to be up for negotiation.
Yep. So previously, like you had mentioned, you could write off your state and local income taxes as part of your itemized deductions. And one of the big changes, especially on our side, that we saw with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is the standard deduction became much higher than it was previously. And I'm going to butcher these numbers, but I know it's like something like 70 to 80% of people now take the standard deduction when that used to be closer to 50. And part of the reason is because it's so much higher. And so you need more itemized deductions than the standard deduction. Otherwise, you're always going to take the standard deduction, right? You're going to take the higher of either your itemized or your standard. And with the capping of the state and local income taxes at 10,000 and the higher standard deduction, most people fall into that category of not itemizing, just taking the standard deduction. So even with the uncapping of this, it may not actually change your taxes unless you pay a high amount of state and local income taxes. Like you said, the most common sources for that is if you are earning income in a state that has a tax. For example, the state of Michigan has a state tax of 4.25%. So every dollar that you earn, you pay a 4.25% on that, right? And so that would be something that you could be part of your itemized deduction. The other big line item there is the local tax, which is for most people is property taxes, right? And so the property taxes that you pay. So if you own a house and you have a big property tax bill, and as we're all, I'm sure, aware, those tax bills are going up every year as well. And so as those go up, that's another thing. So you can combine your state income tax and your property taxes are the most common items. And they also tend to be some of the bigger items that would go into that calculation of what your itemized deduction is. And so a part of this conversation about the SALT cap also revolves around, like you said, AMT, which is the alternative minimum tax, which is basically, it hasn't gone away per se, but it's not we don't see it as much anymore because of that state and local income tax cap. And so there's talk about revising that to maybe capture some of that state and local income tax deduction back. And so it's interesting, like the original 2017 was supposed to be, hey, we're going to make things simple. You're going to be able to do your taxes. Most people are going to be able to do their taxes on like a postcard size, right? And now, actually, as a result of that, I think taxes are more complicated and longer. And so none of this stuff really addresses the simplicity issue. And I think we're going to continue to see an increase in, if we have more people that are now having to file for AMT, that's more forms, more work. And so it seems like our complexity is going up, not down at this point. But I digress. The other big one is, I think in result of kind of where we saw the markets go last week and this week after the election. So yeah, the markets have reacted positively to the announcement of Donald J. Trump as our next president. And a lot of that was kind of behind this idea of lower taxes for corporations. Which is something that he kind of campaigned on, and it previously had lowered taxes when he was in office back in 2017 on the corporate side of things. And that brings up the QBI deduction, which relates to small business and your ability as a pass-through entity to deduct some of your income on the business side. And the idea behind that is corporate tax rates went down, and so we also need to give small business owners some of that deduction. Otherwise, they're all going to run out and just form corporations, which isn't the best solution as well. And so it's potentially, if we get a decrease in corporate taxes, we might also see an increase in the ability to deduct what is considered the QBI deduction. And then we also have the estate tax exemption. You want to walk us through that, Cole?
Yeah, so the estate tax exemption for individuals, I believe, is something in the neighborhood of 13,610,000, and you can double that if you're a married couple.
Somewhere in
So
the neighborhood
obviously,
of that
most
exact
people.
number.
Yeah, I think that's as I was getting there. I'm like, I think that's the exact number. But so obviously, most Americans don't, especially married Americans, don't get close to that cap. But one thing that was a concern for a lot of people who are in the business of estate planning, whether that's attorneys or financial planners, is that if the TCJ was going to be sunsetting, I believe in theory it was going to go back to the original number, which was a million. So, like a married couple would only have a $2 million estate tax exemption. So, if you had a net worth of $5 million when you passed, that would mean that the $3 million above that exemption would be taxed at estate tax rates, which are currently 40%. So, that was definitely causing some headaches. And on the bright side of things, now it looks like there's a pretty good chance that that's at least going to remain in place, if not be raised a little bit more. So, definitely alleviates some estate planning stress for people in our world.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the original 2017, the talk was to eliminate it altogether, which didn't
Mhm.
happen. But still, it looks like it will remain high, which is good news for most people. $1 million isn't as much as it used to be, obviously, and so going back to something like that would have caused some major planning needs for a lot of folks. The other thing that's kind of got some bipartisan support around it is the child tax credit increase to about 3,600. We'll see what happens there, but I think there's a lot of support on both sides of the aisle for increasing the child tax credit, which currently sits at 2,000. It was actually up to this 3,600 back during the pandemic, and then came back down to 2,000. So time will tell on that. One of the things that I always like to remind people, especially as it relates to the stuff that we're talking about, none of this is in the law. None of this is actually happening yet. There's, I'm sure, to be lots of twists and turns when it comes to what actually comes out of this. And hopefully, like I said, we can get some clarification in the first couple months of the year so we can do planning. But what we do not recommend is you go out and you listen to some of the stuff Nick and Cole talked about today and start making tax planning decisions based on the speculation of what could or couldn't happen, right? And so,
Mhm.
interestingly enough, there was some thought around, depending on who gets into office and where we're at, maybe we do start doing some tax planning in 2024, thinking that things potentially go up or get worse. It wasn't that wasn't my recommendation for most people, but we do kind of, it seems to me to be a little bit more of an ease of, a lot of this stuff that we have in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act will probably continue like it is. So there's not this real rush of, going out and doing things in 2024 and 2025 because the law was going to sunset and tax brackets were automatically going to go up somewhere between 1% to 4%. And so that does give us a little bit more time to not rush those things. And, as we always like to say around here, right, Cole, that people make the worst financial decisions when there's the most emotion going around, right? And so, end of the year deadline, got to get things done. Maybe don't like who's in office and wanting to get things in a lower tax bracket, and maybe that turns out not to help you. So definitely don't make emotional decisions, especially as it relates to what potentially could or will not change from the tax code. So a couple things to think about long term, depending on kind of what happens over the next couple of years. And that is Roth conversions, contributions. You want to kind of talk through our thought process there, Cole?
Sure. So part of the retirement planning game, as far as making contributions to, like, let's say a 401k or a traditional IRA versus making Roth contributions, is that you're kind of making a bet. So the bet that you make when you are making a Roth contribution is that you think that taxes are going to be higher in the future. or you are going to be in a higher bracket. So you want to pay the tax now and take it out tax-free later. Traditional IRAs and 401ks make the opposite bet. So if we are currently existing under the assumption that rates are either going to remain the same or potentially go lower, it may potentially make sense to do more Roth contributions now or to make more Roth conversions now than in the future. But again, until we know exactly what that's going to look like, what the future makeup of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or whatever replaces it or it's built upon it, we don't know that for sure. But that's the general framing of the discussion.
Yeah, that's not new for us, right? Like we look at this stuff every year for our clients and recommend people do look at these things anyways, as you know, irregardless of what kind of tax laws are out there, just making sure this is the perfect time of year to do that because you have all the information, right? There's probably not going to be any surprises in terms of income or things like that, or there's less likely to be big surprises given that we only have, about 6 weeks or so left before the end of the year. So it's a really good time to review those things and just think through those things, work with your tax advisor, work with your financial planner to try to figure out if making a conversion makes sense for your long-term planning. So now we get the pleasure, Cole, of switching gears to Trump's tariff proposal. You want to explain to our listeners what exactly a tariff is?
Sure. Yeah. So a tariff, most simply put, is just a tax on imported goods. So goods that are being sent into the U.S. And for what it's worth, tariffs have existed for a long time. Tariffs in some way or another are kind of present in many different industries, whether you're shipping things into the US or to China or to Mexico or to just about anywhere. There's almost always some sort of a tax that's going to be applied to moving goods across borders. From a free market standpoint, the general consensus for a long time has been having no tariffs, having free trade is going to be the best for markets. So it's definitely something for us to keep our eye on as President Trump has talked about placing substantial tariffs on Chinese and Mexican imported goods, particularly things that are related to manufacturing like vehicles. I think on the campaign trail he was talking about like if they were going to try to make Ford F-150s in Mexico and sell it back to the U.S., it was going to be like a 200% tariff, which obviously is probably a little bit facetious, but it's doing things like that obviously do have significant economic impacts, and it's going to be something for us to keep our eye on for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was also some talk thrown around about we'll just get rid of income tax in general and just collect all of our government revenue through tariffs, which, on the surface level sounds great, right? Like, hey, I don't have to pay taxes anymore. We're going to make somebody else pay taxes. But as we love to say, there's no free lunches when it comes to finances and really the economy as well. And so when you have a tariff or a tax on an imported good, what happens is those taxes get passed on to the consumer in the form of higher prices, right? And so that is in the short term potentially what we are worried about when it comes to the economy and the potential impact of tariffs. There's been at least a dozen estimates that proposed tariffs could have a harmful effect on the economy. In the short term, the things that we're worried about happening are potentially inflation and higher unemployment as a result of those things. Those, in the history and looking back at tariffs, sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. It just kind of depends. I don't think we've ever had a situation, at least not recently, where we've had this large scale of tariffs. So it's really hard to say how the modern economy would, react to that. But the long term gets a lot more clear in terms of what that looks like. And that is typically adjustments involving lower income and production. If you think about it on the surface level, right, what we're doing by increasing tariffs is we are reducing competition, right? We're reducing international competition. And that, the theory behind that is the protective company, the US companies might grow, but what typically happens in most cases, if not all, is that the result is less efficient production, right? And that leads to reduced economic output and lower incomes in the long run. Because if you're protected, you don't have to work as hard, right?
Yeah.
If the competition has to pay way more in taxes than you do, right? It'd be like me and you going into the widget business, and you have to pay a 50% tax, and I don't have to pay any tax. We can do the same amount of work, and I'd be 50% more profitable, right?
Yep.
And so that's where it really kind of leads to this, and it's interesting to me because I always felt like the U.S. economy was built on competition, right? We have um, what's the word I'm looking for?
Monopolistic.
Anti-monopoly,
Uh,
right? Because we don't want
uh,
one company dominating an industry because they can squeeze out the competition and then they don't have to work as hard, right? And so this is kind of the opposite of that, where we're squeezing out the international competition. And that means potentially that the US companies don't have to innovate, they don't have to work as hard, they don't have to get better as fast. And that, in the long run, leads to lower incomes and less economic output. And so that's kind of the scary part of how this potentially shakes out. But like we said, there's no telling what exactly is going to happen in the short run because we haven't really had this scale of tariffs in the modern economy. And our economy is very complex and it may not react the way that it has in the past. And so it will be interesting to see if or how much of this actually gets input. But it is something that's definitely a hot button that a lot of people are talking about, and it does potentially have long-term ramifications on our economy.
it definitely does.
So, with that being said, let's flip things to a better outcome, and that is the historical impact of presidential elections on markets. What does history tell us about presidential elections and
Sure.
markets, Cole?
So, well, first of all, if you were in a meeting with us this fall, you've already heard this before. But the really pleasant news from an investor standpoint is that, generally speaking, historically speaking, the markets don't really care who the president is. Really, what markets want to know is they want to have a feeling of certainty. They don't like unpredictability, and the unpredictability of guessing who a president is going to be in an election year tends to cause a lot of volatility. But historically, once the president has been elected and is in office, things tend to cool off and go back to our traditional historic returns. I think for a Republican, it's like 10.1%, and a Democrat, it's 10.2% on average, or vice versa, but basically identical. So, if history is any indicator, things in theory should kind of keep trucking along business as usual.
Yeah, and another thing that I love to remind people this time of year with everything going on is, retirement planning is a long-term process, right? It's not so much what happens in the next 4 months as it is what happens in the next, 40 years, over the next 40 years, right? We're going to go through these times of economic slowdown, and we're going to go through these boom times, which we've been in realistically for the last couple of years. And so that is not the end all be all. We don't recommend making decisions based on what's, potential tax cuts are happening or what potential tariffs are happening and what that may or may not mean for our economy. Overall, we've been very resilient, which is why we also preach things like diversification and long-term investing. Those things have not changed as a result of any of the election stuff, and we still feel strongly that that is the best way to create that long-term retirement and achieve your retirement goals is through those things. And so nothing has really changed as a result of that. And so even though the world around you seems like it's on fire, depending on which news station you listen to at what time, that realistically, the short term isn't going to impact the long term viability of your plan. And so keep that in mind. Financial planning is a process that's not an endpoint, right? And it's an ongoing thing. And so we're thinking about these things, we're making adjustments where it makes sense, but we're also taking our time and being cautious about what potentially may or may not happen. So I'll get off my soapbox now. Cole, this has been fantastic. Appreciate you stepping in for Dave and challenging us today with some difficult topics. Always good
Yeah.
because this is the thing that people are thinking about out here. And so, to our listeners, if you have questions or comments, please email us at info@srbadvisors.com. If you want to come in and talk about your retirement plan and how some of this stuff might potentially impact you, we'd love to have that conversation and look forward to it. Thanks, Cole. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you very much.